The small town of Deerhorn Crossing in the Montana Territory, 1879, was no stranger to strange happenings, but today was different. Today, the entire town packed into the modest church at the edge of town, not to celebrate love, but to witness a spectacle. The church, worn by the relentless winds of the frontier, was filled with a mix of anticipation and whispered judgments. The pews were filled with townsfolk, but there was no sense of joy in the air, just the tense quiet before the storm. As the doors creaked open, all eyes turned to the woman standing in the doorway. Elena, a small figure dressed in a modest white gown. Her hands gripped a dried bouquet of flowers, the lace gloves trembling slightly. Her face, pale and determined, betrayed none of the storm that raged inside her. Her pale blue eyes scanned the crowd, and though she couldn't hear the murmurs, she felt them. She could see the pity, the whispers, the raised eyebrows. They didn't come to celebrate her marriage. No, they were there to mock. The town didn't care for Elena, only her silence. They all knew she couldn't hear. They all knew that she was different. Some of the more cruel townsfolk exchanged quick glances, whispering about how this poor girl was about to marry a man who surely didn't know what he was getting into. "What's the point of marrying a woman who can't even hear the vows?" One voice whispered sharply. "Elijah's marrying a ghost," another added, their laughter ringing out in the silent church. Elena kept walking, though. She could feel every single gaze on her, the judgment seeping through the air like smoke, but she didn't let it stop her. No, this wasn't just a wedding for her. It was a chance to prove that silence didn't mean weakness. It wasn't going to be the pity they expected. She was here for a reason, and she would not be dismissed. The murmurs that followed her down the aisle were deafening in their own way. Elena's hands tightened on the bouquet, but her head stayed high. Every step was a battle, every movement a defiance of the world that had tried to silence her for so long. As she reached the altar, her gaze shifted to Elijah, her groom. He stood there, his back straight, but his eyes, cold as ice, were not filled with love. Not for her. This was the moment she had long feared, seeing the man she was supposed to marry, the man she thought would accept her, look at her as though she were less than. She would soon realize that what she thought was love was nothing more than obligation, and the world would make her feel like nothing more than an outsider. Elijah's cruel rejection. The priest stood before them, his book open, ready to lead them through the sacred vows. But when he turned to Elijah, asking the age-old question, "Do you take this woman?" there was an agonizing pause. The air grew thick with tension. Elena's heart raced as her gaze flicked to her groom. Surely Elijah would speak. Those words, the ones that would bind them together forever. But instead, his lips moved in a way that no one could have expected. "I can't marry a woman who doesn't even know when someone says her name." Elijah's voice rang clear through the church. It felt like the ground fell away beneath her. Elena's eyes locked on his lips as he spoke those harsh words. Her heart shattered in an instant. She could not hear the laughter that followed, but she could see it, could feel it. The cruel, mocking expressions of the crowd flooded her with shame. She couldn't understand why he would say such a thing, why this man, the one she thought she loved, could treat her this way. The laughter echoed in her ears, louder than anything she had ever heard before. It wasn't just from the crowd, it was in her own mind. Every chuckle, every sideways glance, every cruel whisper, it all seemed to collapse onto her at once, until she couldn't breathe. Her bouquet slipped from her hands. She watched as it hit the floor, a symbol of the love she thought would last. Her knees buckled and she crumpled to the floor, her gown twisting beneath her. She was invisible to everyone in that moment, just another part of the joke. The shame burned through her, but she couldn't hear the words that accompanied it. The world around her was loud with mockery, but she was surrounded by a deafening silence of her own. Colt Brener's bold stand. Just when Elena thought she could no longer endure, a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't Elijah's, it wasn't the crowd's. This voice was firm, unwavering, and it carried with it an authority that silenced everything else. That's enough. All heads turned toward the back of the church, where a tall, broad figure emerged from the shadows. Colt Brener, the widowed rancher, stepped forward. His boots struck the floor with each deliberate step, and his eyes, dark and full of resolve, were locked onto Elena. The room fell quiet. The priest stopped mid-sentence, and even the murmurs of the crowd died down. No one expected Colt Brener to be here. He was a man of few words, never one to draw attention to himself. But today, he stood taller than any man in the room. Without hesitation, Colt walked straight to Elena's side. She was still on the floor, struggling to regain her composure, her hands still trembling from the humiliation. But Colt didn't flinch. He didn't pity her. He didn't offer her false comfort. Instead, he crouched beside her, offering a steady hand that she took without hesitation. "She is better than all of you," Colt's voice rang out, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. The shock was palpable. The gasps that followed were louder than any of the cruel comments Elena had endured. Colt wasn't offering charity. He wasn't playing the hero. He was making a declaration. Elena wasn't broken, and no one had the right to treat her like she was. Colt didn't ask for permission. He wasn't waiting for approval. His eyes met Elena's, and for the first time since she had walked into that church, she saw something in his gaze that made her feel seen. She wasn't invisible anymore, and Colt wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her a future. He turned to the crowd, "And I will marry her now." The room remained silent, frozen in disbelief, but Colt didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate, and neither did Elena. She stood, heart pounding, as the world around her slowly began to make sense again, not because of the words she had expected to hear, but because of the ones that mattered. A defiant decision. In the wake of Colt's bold declaration, the church was still. Elena's mind raced. She had been so sure of what this moment was supposed to be, the marriage of her dreams, the union of her heart. But instead, she had found nothing but mockery, cruelty, and a bitter rejection. But now, with Colt at her side, things had changed. She wasn't the girl who had been laughed at anymore. She wasn't broken. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Colt, her heart full of confusion and hope. He hadn't spoken much, but everything about his presence told her she was more than worthy. He wasn't looking at her with pity, he was looking at her with respect. The priest hesitated, unsure of what to do in the face of Colt's resolve. The silence grew heavier, but Colt didn't look away from Elena. His eyes never wavered. "Yes," he said simply, his voice unwavering, and with that single word, the town was silenced once more. No judgment, no mockery, just a quiet acceptance that had been missing from this church since Elena first stepped inside. Elena wasn't just getting married, she was reclaiming her story. She wasn't an object of ridicule, she was strong, and for the first time in her life, she was standing beside someone who saw her for who she truly was. A new life at the ranch. As the ceremony came to a close, Colt led Elena outside the church. The bright, unforgiving sun of the Montana Territory greeted them as they stepped into the open air. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, some still unsure of what had just happened, others filled with judgment. The murmurs were quieter now, but still present, like a buzz in the background. Colt didn't look back at the crowd. His eyes were set straight ahead, his jaw tight, and with a firm hand, he helped Elena onto his horse. Her body was stiff with tension, the weight of the day's events pulling at her. But as Colt took his place beside her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: comfort. not out of sympathy or pity, but out of genuine care. He wasn't saving her. He was standing beside her. They rode through the vast Montana landscape, the wind whipping past them, carrying away the remnants of the church's judgment. The ranch lay ahead, wide and open, stretching out before them like the future Elena hadn't dared to dream of. A new chapter, though one still clouded with uncertainty, was about to begin. At the ranch, Colt showed Elena around. It was simple, a small wooden cabin, rough-hewn furniture, and the wild, untamed land stretching for miles in every direction. There were no grand gestures, no flowery words. Colt didn't try to explain things to her, nor did he demand anything from her. He simply gave her space, space to breathe, space to exist. The first few days were hard. Elena wasn't used to silence this peaceful. The quiet was different here. There were no people to mock her, no whispers to follow her. Yet she felt the weight of her own silence. She had spent so long in a world that treated her as invisible, but here she wasn't just invisible. She didn't know where she fit in, but with Colt she realized it wasn't about fitting in. It wasn't about changing who she was. Colt never treated her like she was broken. He didn't talk to her like she was someone to be pitied. For the first time, Elena felt like her silence was not something to overcome. It was something to embrace. As they sat together one evening, Colt scribbled something on a small slate board and turned it to her. It read, "You are safe here." Elena blinked, her heart swelling with emotion. These simple words, written with no fanfare or ceremony, were more meaningful than any vows could have been. She wasn't just safe physically, she was safe in her own silence, in her own skin. Elena's struggle with silence. In the days that followed, Elena spent much of her time alone in the cabin. Colt was always close by, working on the ranch, but he didn't hover over her. He gave her the time she needed to process everything, to make sense of her new reality. It wasn't an easy transition. Her entire life had been defined by her deafness, by the way others saw her. The cruel words she had heard her whole life echoed in her mind. She spent long hours staring out the window at the vast fields of the ranch, lost in her thoughts. The silence wasn't new to her. It was something she had lived with her whole life. But now, in this place of peace and safety, it felt heavier. She didn't know where she belonged. The world outside was loud, full of people with voices, with opinions. But here there was just space. There were no expectations, no judgment. One evening, as Elena sat by the fire, she noticed a small notebook on the table. It was simple, leather-bound, and worn at the edges. She opened it to the first page and found a message from Colt. "You are safe here." Her throat tightened as she read the words. The weight of them settled deep in her chest. She wasn't alone here. Colt hadn't just taken her away from the cruelty of the town. He had given her a place to belong. And for the first time, Elena felt a sense of calm that she hadn't known in years. But even with that sense of calm, she still felt the echo of her past, of the judgments, the harsh words, the cruelty. She hadn't forgotten the way the townspeople looked at her, the way they mocked her. It was hard not to. Yet Colt never once made her feel like she needed to be fixed. He didn't look at her with pity. He saw her for who she was, and he respected her. That respect, more than anything else, began to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on her for so long. The first signs of change. As the days passed, Elena began to adjust to the quiet rhythm of life at the ranch. There was no rush, no pressure. For the first time, she felt like she had the space to breathe. Colt's actions were gentle, no force, no hurry, but they spoke volumes. Every gesture, every small act was a reminder that she wasn't a burden. She was simply Elena, a woman who had lived with her silence, and Colt didn't see that as a weakness. One afternoon, while walking through the ranch, Elena came across a young boy standing at the edge of the field. His mother stood nearby, watching him with concern. The boy was looking at Elena, his eyes wide with curiosity. His mother explained that he couldn't hear, that he had seen Elena signing and had asked if she would teach him. Elena felt a surge of warmth in her chest. Here was someone else who had lived in silence, someone who understood her world. Without hesitation, Elena knelt beside the boy and smiled, gesturing to the ground, to the sky, to herself. She began teaching him the basics of sign language, her hands moving slowly, deliberately, guiding him through each sign. For the first time, Elena didn't feel isolated. She wasn't just teaching him, she was sharing a piece of herself, a part of her world that she had kept hidden for so long. And as she watched the boy's face light up with understanding, something shifted in her. She wasn't broken, she wasn't invisible. She was capable, and she had something to offer. From that moment on, Elena found herself teaching more and more. It wasn't just the boy. As the days went on, more and more people came to her, asking for lessons. They weren't just asking to learn signs. They were asking to understand. And Elena realized that her silence, something she had always viewed as a barrier, was now a bridge. She wasn't just teaching language. She was teaching acceptance. She was teaching the world how to listen. A quiet revolution. As word spread about Elena's lessons, the town began to change. At first, it was only a handful of people who sought her out, but soon more families came. People who had lived in isolation, people who had been cast aside, came to her for help. Elena didn't just teach them sign language, she gave them something more. She gave them a voice. Colt, ever supportive, brought her a book one evening, American Sign Language, a beginner's guide. The gesture, simple as it was, meant the world to her. It was a symbol that Colt didn't see her as broken. He saw her as whole. He saw her as a woman who had the power to change not only her own life, but the lives of those around her. As the weeks passed, Elena's role in the town grew. No longer was she the deaf bride from the wedding. She had become someone the town looked up to. She was no longer just a woman in the background. She was Elena, the teacher, the guide, the one who showed them how to see the world in a new way. The once dismissive town had transformed into a community that valued her, a place where silence wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be understood. Elena had changed the town, not with her voice, but with her actions, her strength, and her ability to love despite everything. The town's transformation. The Harvest Festival was approaching, a long-standing tradition in Deerhorn Crossing. It was always a time of laughter, music, and dancing, but this year it felt different. The town had changed, subtly at first, but now it was undeniable. People who had once scoffed at Elena now sought her out. The town had begun to listen. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the town square as preparations began. Hay bales were stacked high, and the smell of freshly baked pies wafted through the air. Children darted between booths, their laughter ringing out, but amidst the bustle there was an air of respect, something that had been missing before. Elena wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was a part of the community, her influence rippling through the town. One evening, as the townsfolk were setting up the stage for the evening's festivities, the mayor, a man who had once dismissed Elena as nothing more than a novelty, stood up. His voice, usually gruff, was quieter now. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before speaking. "We've had many reasons to gather here over the years, but this time, it's for something different," he said. "This year, we're honoring one of our own. Elena, would you please come up and share a few words?" The crowd fell silent, and Elena's heart leaped into her chest. This was the moment she had feared, the moment when her silence would be on display again, when she would have to face the town's scrutiny. She looked at Colt, standing just behind her. his strong hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't say a word, but his presence was a quiet reassurance. He had always stood by her, and now he was silently encouraging her to stand in front of the world. Elena hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never spoken in public, never before in front of the entire town, but she felt something stir within her. This wasn't a moment of fear, it was a moment of triumph. She had come so far, it was time for them to hear her, even if they couldn't hear the sound of her voice. Slowly she moved to the stage, her fingers trembling as she climbed the steps. She turned to face the crowd, her gaze sweeping over their faces. They were no longer the same crowd that had laughed at her. Now they watched her with respect, with curiosity. She raised her hands and began to sign. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, but each gesture was filled with meaning, filled with everything she had ever wanted to say. "You once saw me as broken," she signed, "but I was never broken, just unheard. Now you're learning to listen." There was no applause, no rush to acknowledge her words. Instead, the crowd stood still, watching in reverent silence. And then, slowly, it began. One person clapped, then another and another. The applause grew louder, but it wasn't out of pity. It wasn't a reaction to a performance. It was a genuine recognition of the strength Elena had shown. It was an acknowledgement of how far she had come and the change she had brought about in them all. Colt stepped forward, his hand resting gently on her back. He translated her message for the crowd, his voice calm but filled with pride. When he finished, the applause was deafening. For the first time, Elena didn't feel like an outsider. She didn't feel like someone who had been cast aside. She was part of this community, and they saw her, truly saw her. A love reborn. The years that followed the Harvest Festival were filled with quiet change. Elena and Colt continued to build their life together, not just for themselves, but for the entire town. They opened a school for the deaf, a place where silence was not a barrier but a means of connection. Elena became a teacher, showing children and adults alike that there was no shame in silence. In fact, it could be the very thing that brought people together. Colt, though he never said much, supported Elena every step of the way. His love for her was clear in every gesture, every small act of kindness. He never tried to fix her or change her. He simply loved her for who she was. Their second wedding was simple, nothing like the first. It took place beneath the cottonwood tree on their property, a place that had come to symbolize their quiet, strong love. No vows were spoken, for they had already lived them one day at a time. The quiet moments, the shared glances, the understanding between them, that was their vow. They didn't need words to express what they felt. It was written in their actions, in the way they cared for each other. In the years to come, they continued to grow, not just as a couple, but as a family. The school they had founded flourished. The town that had once mocked Elena now looked to her for guidance. Children came to her for lessons, and adults sought her out to learn. She had become more than just a deaf bride. She had become a symbol of strength, of resilience, of love that didn't need to be heard to be understood. And Colt, her steadfast partner, stood by her through it all. His quiet love, his unwavering support, was the foundation upon which their life was built. He never needed to say much. He didn't have to. His actions spoke volumes. And Elena, the once deaf bride, found that in the silence of their love, they had built something more beautiful than any words could describe. As the years went on, Elena became known far and wide, not just for her strength, but for the quiet revolution she had sparked. She had taught the town that silence wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. She had shown them that love, in its truest form, didn't need to be loud to be heard. She had taught them how to listen, and as she stood beside Colt, looking out over the ranch they had built together, she knew that her silence had been her greatest gift. It had taught the world How to truly hear.